Yeah.
I mean, when you work out all the possible combinations, you will find over 125 different sets of behaviors that would fit into the American Psychiatric Association's diagnosis of autism.
Oh my goodness.
So depending on who you ask, almost any kid at any given time could qualify for a diagnosis of autism, and it explains those billboards.
Well, that's kind of like similar to the ADD and ADHD, isn't it? I mean, the way they categorize those.
Yeah. So now we're starting to see why so many kids suddenly have autism. There was an interesting study done in the state of California where they looked at the statistics of so many more kids being called having autism. And it coincided with autism becoming recognized as a diagnosis that would get the school district extra money if they had one of those kids enrolled in the class. And what they saw was an exact parallel decrease in the diagnosis of mental retardation. So what we used to call mental retardation, we're now calling autism. Only at least there, those kids can be tested by IQ, and as I'll talk later, IQ is not a test for autism. So some have said it's just a bait and switch, that you're just renaming something, but that really doesn't explain the incredible explosion in the autism diagnosis. I'm starting to worry about what's in the water. There's so many autistic kids. But it gets even more muddled when you consider this autism spectrum disorder that I mentioned earlier. And this, believe it or not, this is nothing more than some strange behaviors that aren't quite autistic, but someone decides they're sort of autism-like. Honest to God. There's no specific cutoff who definitely has autism and who has autism spectrum disorder. These kids used to be called shy, a little backward. Again, maybe they have an intense interest in something, the kid who's still playing with his train set when he's 12 years old, that kind of thing. But it's now called autism spectrum disorder. And it gets even worse. At the extreme end of autism spectrum disorder is Asperger's syndrome. And here you could see really, how much the definition of autism has been stretched. Whereas the original definition of autism meant that the kid could not function socially. In Asperger's, the child is said to be, quote, high functioning. I mean, this is like saying a hamburger that's not hamburger, but it still tastes like hamburger. I mean, okay, it's like if the car is broken, but it actually runs great. I mean, one of the fundamental criteria of autism was that the kid could not socially interact and couldn't function socially, and they're calling Asperger's high functioning. It's really ridiculous. With Asperger's, we're so far removed from the original definition that it's really been completely perverted into something else. Now, and the problem, that's the problem of studying autism. This is the problem I had with the lawsuit that I was just a resource witness for, was that, I didn't have any particular opinion about it either way. I was just reporting what the medical literature said, but when you have the diagnosis so vague and you have all these questionable diagnoses, it's going to produce questionable studies. If they take all these kids that are somewhere or other on the autism spectrum disorder based on various checklists and different criteria, and then you try to study their brain scans, if there actually really is any brain scan abnormality in autistic kids, you wouldn't know it because you have all these other kids in there.
Right.
Because the diagnosis has gotten so wide. So the science is very, very frail because of the questionable diagnosis problem. Now, the next thing to know about, I wanted to show an Asperger's kid. A lot of times kids don't get this diagnosis of Asperger's until they're preteen or early teen years. And, this didn't used to get diagnosed. This was called a phase, but they get the diagnosis, and there's a real hazard sometimes to the diagnosis when it comes to some of the more treacherous treatments that are being offered. Now, the next thing to know about autism is that the cause hasn't been established. As I mentioned earlier, the diagnosis can be questionable in a large number of cases, so it's tricky to talk about causes when the fact is that the patient's been mislabeled to begin with. And how can we study the cause when we've got all these spectrum kids in there? Now, one of the things I want to talk about is this Dr. Gilbert. He is a doctor from Sweden that now has left Sweden in disgrace and has resurfaced in the United Kingdom. And he is a psychiatrist, actually, who was the most prominent doctor who campaigned relentlessly to popularize this diagnosis of autism and autism spectrum disorders. In fact, he's the author of several scientific books, and he's authored or co-authored more than 300 research articles on ADD and autism. He's published more on autism than any other single doctor in the world. And his studies are the ones that were the first to report a fantastically increased incidence of autism. Supposedly, he found that autism went from being exceedingly rare at less than 1 in 10,000 to now supposedly afflicting more than 7 per 10,000. He published studies showing that autism and other childhood mental disorders were steeply on the rise, and this scared a lot of people into thinking that their kids needed to go on medication. Now, he's got his own criteria for autism and Asperger's syndrome. And his Asperger's syndrome criteria is really ridiculous. It's not the least bit scientific. Listen to this. For Asperger's, according to Gilbert, you have to evaluate 6 areas, and each area has anywhere from 1 to 5 descriptions. To satisfy the Gilbert diagnosis of Asperger's, the child has to have at least 2 of 4 criteria in Area 1, 1 of 4 criteria in Area 2, 1 of 2 criteria in Area 3, 3 out of 5 criteria in Area 4, 1 out of 5 criteria in Area 5, and 1 of 1 in Area 6. Very unscientific. It's ridiculous. It reads like a Dr. Seuss story or something. I mean, this is more like 10 Ways to Know Your Husband is Cheating magazine quiz than anything resembling a medical text. You know what I'm saying? But here's the interesting thing. Doctors and social workers and human rights investigators found that Gilbert's reports of childhood mental disorders were like unbelievable. And so they demanded to see Dr. Gilbert's research data, and he refused to come up with it. And this led to a public inquiry in Sweden, which led to legal action. And when he was actually ordered to produce the raw research data or face seizure of the documents, he quickly shredded his papers. In fact, his son named Dr. Gilbert is the one who apparently shredded his papers. Over 100,000 pages worth of pages were shredded. And he shredded his, quote, scientific papers rather than stand up to a court of inquiry of, wait a second, how can you be publishing all this, quote, scientific data in major journals in the United States and everywhere else? 100,000 pages of documents. So looks like he had something to hide. And he is the primary person that's responsible for the popularization of autism professionally around the English-speaking world. So, autism to me is another example of the modern idea that every variation in life needs a diagnosis and an eventual treatment. There are definite cases of children with severe disturbances that prevent them from functioning in society. Okay, that is without a doubt. But not every variation of behavior is a disease. And what I would advise for any parents that are listening is that if your child is labeled with autism or autism spectrum disorder, beware of the pitfalls of this multiple choice opinion-based diagnosing. Now, let's go on to what tests are abnormal in autism.
Moira, just a quick question. Yeah. While Gilbert was doing his thing, when he began to speak about this alarming rise in the incidence of autism, okay, it was probably false, but did he ever tender any reason for that rise in diagnoses?
No. There was never, there's various theories as we'll go into the causes and stuff. Okay. He was a big one for twin studies and all of that, and obviously there's always been a search for a biochemical or an anatomic, physiologic, pathological cause. Mm-hmm. Of course, if we don't even have the diagnosis based on something specific, it's very hard to find a cause. Right. So he was all, he very, very much promoted drug treatment on the theory that there was a basic brain biochemical abnormality, which has never been proven. So if you take a diagnosis that doesn't have definite criteria, and then you attach to that a theory of causation, and you use those two very shaky things to justify treatment, you are so far removed from anything scientific.
Right, right.
And then they attempted to study the brains of these children after they had been on psychoactive medications, which totally disrupt normal brain chemistry.
Right.
So it further pollutes any real study of autistic children. And that's why we don't have good data to work with today. So let's take a look at what tests could be abnormal in autism. One thing you really need to know is there's really no definite bodily abnormality or brain damage that consistently shows up under tests or autopsy reports. But what about